Blood and Thunder, the Choctaw-Bigfoot War of 1855. Welcome to Native Legends and History Stories, where forgotten tales of America's first peoples come alive. Tonight, we delve into a remarkable chapter of Choctaw history that challenges our understanding of both human courage and the unknown. Warriors of Two World. Deep in the heart of what would become Oklahoma Territory, a proud warrior culture faced challenges that would test not just their physical strength, but their very understanding of the natural world. The Choctaw people, seasoned veterans of countless conflicts, had built their reputation on a sophisticated military tradition that few could match. Their warriors trained from childhood in a rigorous system that emphasized both individual combat skills and coordinated battlefield tactics. Every young brave learned the intricate arts of tracking, moving silently through dense forest, and engaging enemies in close combat. This wasn't just military training, it was the preservation of a warrior culture that had sustained them through generations of conflict. Before European contact, the Choctaw dominated vast territories in what would become Alabama and Mississippi. Their military prowess wasn't limited to traditional native warfare. They quickly adapted to new challenges as European powers pushed into their lands. During the 17th century's colonial expansion, they formed strategic alliances with the French, primarily to defend against slave raids from tribes allied with English colonists, particularly the Chickasaw. This adaptability extended beyond military matters. As European settlements encroached on their lands, the Choctaw demonstrated remarkable diplomatic skill. They negotiated for fair compensation, engaged in trade, and selectively adopted new technologies while maintaining their cultural identity. When European-style housing appeared in their territories, they studied its advantages and incorporated useful elements into their own building methods. They even accepted missionaries among their people, though they carefully preserved their traditional spiritual practices. By the time of the American Revolution, the Choctaw had become sophisticated players in colonial politics. Their warriors fought on multiple sides of the conflict, some backing the Spanish and British, others supporting American rebels. This wasn't confusion or weakness, but rather a calculated strategy to protect their people's interests in a rapidly changing world. Yet all this diplomatic skill and military might couldn't prevent the tragedy that would reshape their world. Following the Treaty of Doak's Stand in 1820, the Choctaw faced an impossible choice. Their ancestral lands, held since time immemorial, were either sold under duress or simply confiscated. Between 1831 and 1833 came the darkest chapter, the Trail of Tears. 15,000 Choctaw were forced to march hundreds of miles to unfamiliar territory. Winter's brutal cold, disease, and starvation stalked them every step of the way. By journey's end, 2,500 souls had perished. The survivors emerged hardened by their ordeal, carrying not just their physical possessions, but the weight of generational trauma that would influence their decisions for decades to come. The Choctaw story might have ended there, another tragic footnote in America's westward expansion. Instead, they found unlikely champions in the LeFlore family, particularly Chief Greenwood LeFlore. Of mixed French and Choctaw heritage, he became the first centralized leader of the newly unified Choctaw tribes in 1830. Using both his political acumen and his understanding of American power structures, Chief LeFlore secured the largest and most fertile territory granted to any relocated tribe, the lush, forested southeastern corner of present-day Oklahoma. The LeFlore family's influence grew rapidly in their new homeland. Their unique position, straddling both native and European worlds, made them invaluable intermediaries. But it was Chief LeFlore's son Joshua who truly embodied the best of both cultures. In an era when mixed-blood children were often pressured to abandon their native heritage, Joshua did the opposite. He immersed himself in Choctaw traditions while using his father's political connections to advocate for his people. Joshua's dedication earned him deep respect from both Choctaw traditionalists and European settlers. He became the man people turned to when problems needed solving, whether those problems came from inside or outside the tribe. His ability to navigate both worlds would prove crucial in the events to come. Among the most remarkable figures in this new Choctaw territory were the members of the Tubby family. They were giants in both literal and figurative terms. The family patriarch, Hanali Tubby, stood an incredible 8 feet, 2 inches tall, and weighed 540 pounds. His son Hamas and 6 grandsons carried on this impressive legacy, each standing around 7 feet tall and weighing approximately 300 pounds. Despite their intimidating size, the Tubby men were known for their skill as mounted warriors. The irony of these massive men being called light horsemen wasn't lost on their fellow Choctaw, but their battlefield prowess was no laughing matter. They combined their incredible strength with sophisticated cavalry tactics, making them feared and respected throughout the territory. The Tubby family's responsibility extended beyond mere combat. They served as peacekeepers in the region, their very presence often enough to deter trouble. Their reputation appears in multiple historical documents from the mid-19th century, suggesting their influence extended well beyond tribal boundaries. By 1855, 20 years after their forced relocation, the Choctaw had established a remarkable degree of autonomy. They created their own constitution, elected their own officials, and maintained their own system of laws and courts. Their territory, particularly what would become LeFlore County, fostered peaceful trade and cultural exchange with neighboring European settlements. Mixed marriages became common, further strengthening the bonds between communities. Yet beneath this veneer of peace and prosperity, ancient warrior instincts remained sharp. They maintained careful watch over their borders, trained their young men in traditional warrior arts, and kept their weapons close at hand. This vigilance, born of hard experience, would soon prove more valuable than anyone could have imagined. As summer drew to a close in 1855, no one in LeFlore County suspected that they stood on the brink of a confrontation that would test their courage, challenge their understanding of the natural world, and write a new chapter in the annals of both Choctaw history and American folklore. Monsters in the shadows. First blood. The autumn nights in LeFlore County had always brought their share of disturbances. Wolves howling in the distance, livestock stirring restlessly in their pens, the occasional raiding party from hostile tribes. But nothing could have prepared the Choctaw for what began in those early September days of 1855. The first raid came without warning. As dawn broke over the settlement, farmers emerged from their homes to find entire pens emptied overnight. Cattle, swine, and poultry vanished without a trace. In a community where livestock represented not just wealth, but survival through the harsh winter months, such losses cut deep. Yet more baffling than the theft itself was the complete absence of evidence. The Choctaw were no strangers to tracking raiders. Generations of experience had taught them to read the smallest signs: broken twigs, disturbed earth, the pattern of hoofprints that could tell the story of how many horses had passed and how heavily laden they were. But these raids defied all their expertise. No tracks marked the ground around the empty pens. No broken fences or cut ropes suggested how the animals had been taken. It was as if the livestock had simply vanished into thin air. Night after night, the pattern repeated. Sometimes families would be awakened by the panicked squeals of their animals, only to arrive at the pens moments too late. The darkness would already have swallowed both predator and prey. Other times, the theft occurred in complete silence, the morning's first light revealing yet another inexplicable disappearance. The raiders showed an uncanny intelligence in their methods. They never struck when watchmen were posted, somehow sensing when guards were present. Even more disturbing, they managed to avoid every trap set by the farmers. Snares. tripwires, and alarm systems that had proven effective against both animal and human intruders in the past. To combat the bandits, the Choctaw organized mounted patrols into the surrounding hills after each raid. These weren't simple search parties. They were organized units of experienced trackers and warriors, men who had spent their lives reading the language of the wilderness. Despite their generations of tracking knowledge, the raiders remained elusive. They followed the slightest hints: a broken blade of grass, a scuffed rock, the way morning dew was disturbed on tree branches. They searched stream beds where tracks might be preserved in soft mud, checked game trails that could serve as escape routes, and studied the patterns of disturbed wildlife that might indicate the passage of intruders. The futility of their efforts only deepened the mystery. Even the most skilled trackers found themselves baffled. Trails that seemed promising would suddenly vanish, as if their quarry had taken to the air. Signs that indicated a direction of travel would contradict themselves, suggesting impossible routes or leading in circles. The community's initial response was skepticism. Some suggested that younger, less experienced trackers were simply missing obvious signs. Not even their most skilled trackers could find any traces. Whatever they were following seemed to possess an uncanny ability to move without leaving signs. Whatever was stalking their livestock possessed an almost supernatural ability to move without leaving traces. The raiders seemed to know not just the layout of the settlements, but the habits of the guards, the locations of traps, and even the patrol schedules that were regularly changed to prevent predictability. A growing sense of unease settled over LeFlore County. The Choctaw, who had faced down armies and survived forced relocation, found themselves confronting an enemy they couldn't even see, let alone fight. Some began to develop a grudging respect for the tactical brilliance of their unseen adversary, even as they cursed its efficiency. As autumn deepened and the raids continued, the community's losses mounted. Families who had worked years to build up their herds watched their wealth disappear into the night. The psychological toll began to show. Children kept awake by their parents' worried discussions. Farmers spending sleepless nights listening for sounds that might warn of another attack. Warriors frustrated by their inability to protect their people's property. Yet these livestock raids, devastating as they were, would soon be revealed as merely the opening moves in a far darker campaign. The true horror was yet to come, and when it did, it would make these early losses seem trivial by comparison. The predator was testing their defenses, learning their responses, and preparing for something far more sinister than simple theft: the human toll. As October's chill crept across LeFlore County, the nature of the raids took a horrifying turn. The community awoke one morning to find not livestock missing, but people. A young mother had vanished from her home, leaving behind only a half-finished basket of corn. She'd been shelling by candlelight. There were no signs of struggle, no screams in the night, just the same eerie silence that had marked the livestock disappearances. The pattern that emerged over the following weeks sent waves of terror through the settlement. The predators showed a chilling preference for women, particularly those who stayed up late tending to household chores. They struck with the same mysterious efficiency that had characterized the livestock raids. But now the stakes were immeasurably higher. Children began disappearing next. A 10-year-old boy gathering firewood at dusk. 2 sisters who had lingered too long at the stream doing laundry. A infant taken directly from its cradle while its mother stepped out to draw water. Each disappearance followed the same pattern: no warning, no sounds of struggle, no traces left behind. The attacks spread methodically across the territory, from the Arkansas border deep into Choctaw lands. What had begun as isolated incidents in outlying areas soon threatened every family in the region. The raiders showed no preference between Choctaw homes and white settlements, striking wherever opportunity presented itself. Fear transformed daily life in LeFlore County. Families abandoned outlying homes to cluster together in larger groups. Children were kept indoors after sunset, their usual games and chores forgotten. Women moved in groups, even for the simplest tasks. Every household adopted military-style security measures, doors barred with heavy logs, windows shuttered tight, weapons kept within arm's reach at all times. The Choctaws' initial response was to seek help from local authorities. Delegations traveled to nearby towns and military outposts. Local and federal authorities turned a cold shoulder to their pleas. The Choctaw, once again, had only themselves to rely on. The community's fear crystallized into rage during a crucial gathering of tribal elders and warriors. The meeting hall was packed with families of the missing, their grief and desperation palpable in the smoky air. When one elder suggested patience, hoping the raiders might eventually move on, the response was explosive. "What good has hope ever done us?" a father whose daughter had vanished demanded, his voice raw with emotion. "Our children are too terrified to sleep, and you ask us to lean on hope?" The debate that followed was fierce but focused. Some argued for abandoning the most vulnerable settlements, consolidating their people where they could be better protected. Others called for bringing in hunters and trackers from other tribes who might have experience with similar threats. But it was the call for direct military action that resonated most strongly. Fight. The word echoed through the assembly like a war drum. You said it yourself. What good has hope done us? Our wives, mothers, sisters, and children? No. Every able man here, every warrior we can muster, will set out upon the land, and we will not return until our loved ones are safe, and the men who wrought such terror are brought to justice. Believing their enemies to be human, whether justice was delivered by law, bullet, or blade, the Choctaw were indifferent. The disappearances had left no ransoms, no demands, only silence. A dormant fighting spirit had awakened, and the tribe prepared for war. As preparations for the war party began, the atmosphere in LeFlore County shifted from terror to grim resolve. Women who had been hiding in fear now stepped forward to help prepare weapons and supplies. Children who had been kept indoors were organized into messenger teams to maintain communication between settlements. Every aspect of community life was redirected toward supporting the coming military response. The raiders, as if sensing the change in their prey's disposition, increased the frequency of their attacks. In the week it took to organize the war party, 3 more children and 2 women disappeared. But where these losses had once sparked panic, they now hardened the community's determination. Each new disappearance added fuel to the fire of vengeance building in the Choctaws' hearts. The hunter becomes hunted. The war party that assembled in Tuscaloma before dawn was unlike anything the territory had seen in decades. At its heart stood Joshua LeFlore, whose mixed heritage and diplomatic skills had made him the natural choice for command. But it was the presence of the Tubby family that drew all eyes. Hamas and his 6 sons, their massive frames making even their war horses seem small by comparison. The Tubby men weren't just physically imposing. Each was a master of mounted combat, their skills honed through years of serving as the tribe's elite peacekeepers. Their designation as light horsemen might have seemed ironic given their size, but their ability to maneuver on horseback was legendary. They formed the vanguard of what would become a 40-strong war party, each warrior personally chosen for their tracking skills and combat experience. The preparations were meticulous. Each warrior carried not just traditional weapons, but the best firearms they could obtain. They packed light but efficient, knowing speed would be crucial in running down their elusive quarry. Every detail, from the placement of ammunition pouches to the distribution of water skins, reflected generations of warrior wisdom. At 3 a.m., the war party moved out. Their initial confidence was evident. Many believed they would return within days. Their missing people rescued, and the mysterious raiders brought to justice. The column moved silently through the darkness, their horses' hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle any sound that might alert their prey. The first leg of their journey tested both men and mounts. For 8 straight hours, they rode through punishing terrain, stopping only briefly to water their horses when absolutely necessary. The summer heat rose with the sun, turning the Oklahoma wilderness into a furnace. Yet they pressed on, following traces so faint that only the most experienced trackers could discern them. Their first major rest came near the Clover River around midday. This wasn't merely a pause for refreshment. It was a strategic gathering where the party's leaders could consolidate the signs they'd been following and plan their next move. The tracks they'd found were troubling in their inconsistency. Sometimes they seemed to indicate a large group moving heavily laden with prey. At other times, they vanished completely, as if their quarry had taken to the air. Resuming their pursuit at 4:30 that afternoon, the war party found the trail leading them into increasingly difficult terrain. They pushed through storms that would have halted lesser men, traversed rocky grounds that threatened to lame their horses, and navigated dense forests where every shadow might hide their enemy. Day after day, the pursuit continued. The warriors' initial confidence gave way to grim determination as they realized the true challenge of their task. Their quarry seemed to possess an uncanny ability to sense their approach, always staying just beyond reach. Even the youngest members of the party, those who had chafed at the slow pace of the initial tracking, began to understand the methodical nature of this hunt. LeFlore's leadership proved crucial during this phase. He understood that this was no ordinary pursuit, the complete absence of normal signs. The way the trails seemed to defy natural law. All pointed to something beyond their previous experience. Yet he kept these thoughts to himself, maintaining the focus and discipline of his warriors. The Tubby family's expertise became increasingly valuable as the hunt progressed. Their experience in tracking criminals across this territory helped them recognize subtle patterns in their quarry's movement. They noted how the raiders seemed to favor certain types of terrain, how they would double back to confuse pursuit, how they would use natural features to mask their trail. After days of tracking, LeFlore spotted something through his binoculars. Whatever he saw prompted immediate action. The war party charged forward, knowing the chase was finally coming to an end. The final hunt. Trail of death. Whatever LeFlore glimpsed through his binoculars that day transformed the entire hunting party. The measured pursuit of weeks dissolved into urgent action as he spurred his horse forward, the rest of the war party following his lead across the open plain. Their quarry seemed finally within reach, yet the growing sense of wrongness dampened any feelings of triumph. The trail led them to the edge of an ancient forest, unlike any they had encountered in their pursuit. The trees here grew impossibly close together, their branches interweaving to create a canopy so dense that little sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. But it wasn't the darkness that made the warriors hesitate. The first assault came to their nostrils, a stench so profound it seemed to have physical weight. More than simple decay, this was an odor that spoke of prolonged death and deliberate desecration. The seasoned warriors, men who had seen battlefield carnage and weathered summer hunting grounds, found themselves gagging. The younger members of the party retched openly, their bodies rebelling against the overwhelming assault on their senses. Even more telling was the reaction of their mounts. These weren't ordinary trail horses, but seasoned war ponies, animals that had been bred and trained for combat. Yet they reared and bucked, rolling their eyes in terror at the smell emanating from the forest depths. Most of the horses simply refused to advance, their instincts screaming against whatever horror waited in the shadows. Only the mounts of LeFlore and the Tubby family could be urged forward. As the rest of the war party struggled with their panicked horses, these 8 men formed an impromptu scouting party. Each step deeper into the forest seemed to take them further from the natural world they knew. The silence struck them next. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping forest, but an absolute absence of sound that defied natural law. No birds called, no insects chirped. Even the wind seemed to die among the dense trees, as if nature itself shrank from what lay ahead. The warriors, raised in deep connection with the natural world, felt this silence like a physical pain. Their every instinct screamed for retreat, yet they pressed forward. The stench grew stronger, and now they could see its source. The forest floor was littered with signs of prolonged habitation, but not the kind any human would create. Massive areas of vegetation had been crushed flat, creating clearings that bore signs of repeated use. Scattered bones, both animal and horrifyingly human, crunched beneath their feet. The deeper they went, the more the horror mounted. They found crude shelters made by bending young trees together, their branches intertwined in ways that spoke of inhuman strength. These makeshift dens were surrounded by piles of offal and excrement, adding new layers to the already overwhelming stench. The flies were the only living things that seemed to thrive here, their incessant buzzing providing an obscene counterpoint to the unnatural silence. When they reached the main clearing, the true scale of their enemy's depravity became clear. Bodies lay stacked like cordwood, dozens of them, in various stages of decay. The warriors recognized clothing, jewelry, personal items that identified the victims as their missing people. Men who had faced death countless times found themselves shaken to their core. These weren't clean kills for food or even the results of combat. The bodies showed signs of having been played with, torn apart for what could only be described as pleasure. Among the carnage, they made their grimmest discovery: 19 children, their small forms barely recognizable among the larger corpses. The revelation of this particular horror broke something in the warriors' hearts. This wasn't just hunting or raiding. This was an atrocity that demanded answer in blood. The clearing told other stories too, for those with the stomach to read them. The way the bodies were arranged, the evidence of repeated returns to feed, all spoke of intelligence coupled with inhuman appetites. This wasn't the work of simple animals, but neither was it anything their human experience had prepared them for. As the warriors stood frozen in horror, trying to comprehend the scene before them, movement at the clearing's edge snapped them back to alertness. Something large was moving through the trees, and from the sounds, it wasn't alone. The momentary paralysis of shock gave way to racing hearts and tightening grips on weapons. They had found their quarry at last, or perhaps, more terrifyingly, their quarry had found them. Before LeFlore could organize his men for a tactical approach, before they could even properly position themselves for combat, their enemy stepped into view. In that moment, as they faced what emerged from the shadows, even these hardened warriors felt their understanding of the world shift beneath their feet. The beast revealed. What emerged from the forest shadows defied every natural law the warriors knew. 3 creatures towered before them, their forms a nightmarish fusion of human and beast. Each stood significantly taller than even the Tubby men, their lean bodies covered in matted hair that seemed to absorb what little light filtered through the canopy. But it was their faces that froze the blood in the warriors' veins, lips pulled back to reveal yellowed fangs, and eyes that burned with an intelligence that was terrifyingly aware. The beasts carried themselves with an almost regal bearing, showing no fear of the armed men before them. Instead, they beat their massive chests in what seemed like a deliberate challenge, the sound echoing through the unnaturally silent forest. The display spoke not of mindless aggression, but of territorial dominance. These creatures knew they were on their own hunting grounds. LeFlore was the first to break free from the paralysis of shock. Drawing his saber in one fluid motion, he spurred his horse forward in a textbook cavalry charge. It was a maneuver he had executed countless times in battle, one that had never failed to overwhelm human opponents. But these were no human foes. The creature LeFlore targeted showed chilling patience. It stood its ground, calculating, waiting for the precise moment when horse and rider would enter its reach. The warrior's blade never had a chance to strike. With one explosive movement, the beast's arm shot out, its massive hand connecting with the horse's skull. The sound of crushing bone echoed through the clearing as LeFlore's mount crumpled instantly, dead before it hit the ground. Years of combat experience allowed LeFlore to roll clear of his fallen horse, coming up with his Patterson's Colt revolver already drawn. The weapon barked repeatedly, each shot finding its mark in the creature's chest. But where such wounds would have dropped any human or natural beast, these bullets seemed to barely break the skin. The creature's hide proved as tough as oak bark, the wounds barely bleeding as it continued its advance. With his revolver emptied, LeFlore resorted back to his saber. The blade found better purchase than the bullets, drawing genuine blood as he slashed and thrust with the skill that had made him legendary among his people. Each strike would have been fatal to a human opponent, but against this foe, they served only to enrage. The uneven nature of the combat became brutally clear as the other two creatures moved to support their companion. Their coordination revealed a tactical intelligence that made them even more terrifying. While LeFlore remained focused on his initial opponent, one of the others circled behind him with frightening speed for its size. The end came with shocking suddenness. Before any of the watching warriors could shout a warning, the creature behind LeFlore seized his head in its massive hands. There was no prolonged struggle, no chance for last words, or heroic resistance. With a single savage motion, it separated LeFlore's head from his shoulders, the warrior's body crumpling to the forest floor like a dropped marionette. The creature's victory roar, combining their three voices in a blood-chilling howl, broke the spell of horror that had gripped the remaining warriors. Rage replaced fear as they watched the beast holding their leader's severed head aloft like a trophy. The Tubby men, their own massive frames now seeming almost modest in comparison to their foes, dismounted with fluid grace that belied their size. They leveled their weapons, not ordinary rifles but 50 caliber Sharps buffalo guns, weapons designed to bring down the largest beasts on the plains with a single shot. The coordinated volley that followed was delivered with cold precision, 6 heavy rounds striking their targets with devastating effect. Even the creature's supernatural resilience couldn't withstand the massive bullets, and 2 of them fell immediately, their bodies shuddering under the impact. The third beast, though wounded, attempted to flee. But Robert Tubby, Hamas's 18-year-old son, who stood nearly 7 feet tall himself, was not about to let their leader's killer escape. With a speed that matched the creature's own, he ran down the wounded monster. His hunting knife flashed in the dim light as he thoroughly, almost ritualistically, severed its head from its body. Standing over his fallen enemy, Robert lifted the creature's severed head high in a mirror image of what it had done with LeFlore's moments before. His victory cry echoed through the forest, but there was no joy in it, only the grim satisfaction of vengeance achieved and a deadly threat eliminated. The aftermath. The warriors waited in tense silence after the battle, weapons ready for any sign of more creatures. When no further threats emerged from the forest depths, they faced the grim task ahead. The remainder of the war party had arrived, and together they undertook the solemn duty of laying their dead to rest. The work was brutal and exhausting. They had to fight not only the overwhelming stench of decay, but also the foul odor of the creature's waste that saturated the area. Each victim required careful handling for identification, their remains often barely recognizable. The discovery of 19 children among the dead left even the most hardened warriors fighting back tears as they dug the graves. After burying their leader and the recovered victims, debate arose about what to do with the creatures' bodies. The decision to burn them came quickly. No one wanted to risk these abominations somehow surviving their wounds. The bonfire burned through the night, an improvised funeral pyre that sent thick, foul-smelling smoke into the forest canopy. Some accounts claim the warriors gave LeFlore a 21-gun salute, though this detail is disputed. More practical minds suggest that seasoned fighters would have conserved their ammunition, knowing the forest might hold more threats. What's certain is that the return journey was marked by hypervigilance. Every warrior expecting more creatures to emerge from the shadows, seeking revenge. The impact of these events would haunt the survivors for years. The Tubby men, despite their legendary strength and courage, found themselves plagued by nightmares. In the still of night, they would wake in cold sweats, haunted by memories of those inhuman eyes and the terrible efficiency with which the creatures had dispatched their leader. Tales of truth. When we examine historical records, we find curious gaps and contradictions. LeFlore County documents confirm Joshua LeFlore's existence and his death in 1855, but offer no details about how he died. The Tubby family appears in multiple mid-19th century records, their unusual size noted as fact rather than folklore. Yet official histories remain silent about any massive military operation or unexplained disappearances during this period. The mystery deepens when we consider parallel accounts from other tribes. The Kiowa people, for instance, tell a markedly different version through their oral histories. According to Bigfoot researcher Jim King, who received this account directly from a Kiowa elder, their encounters centered around ceremonial women's camps. Following traditional practices, women during their menstrual cycles stayed in special teepees at the camp's edge, considered temporarily unclean and forbidden from contact with warriors. These segregated teepees, the elder explained, attracted large, ape-like creatures drawn by the scent. Unlike the Choctaw account's emphasis on predation, the Kiowa believed these abductions served reproductive purposes. Their version tells of just one creature rather than a group, and their eventual victory came without the massive casualties described in the Choctaw tale. Another fascinating variation emerges from Oklahoma's non-native traditions. Here, the giants weren't hairy beasts at all, but rather white men of unusual size, supposedly descended from Vikings, whose presence in the area dated back to the 1100s. This interpretation transforms the story from cryptid encounter to cultural conflict, though no less extraordinary for the change. Perhaps most intriguing is the account of the Hatukchaya, the witchman whose arrival in the 1830s marked the beginning of a decades-long reign of terror. According to an article in the 1978 McCurtain Sunday Gazette, this powerful witch brought with him a massive creature from Mississippi swamps. The Choctaw named it Hot-Tuk Lucichido, the big black man, and while the witch couldn't command it to kill, he weaponized the creature's terrifying presence against his enemies. The witch's reign ended only through desperate action. A family, driven to their limit, bound him to his bed during a moonless night and set his house ablaze. Local tradition holds that the creature, freed from its master's control, continued to roam the wilderness. A unique detail suggests that anyone brave enough to face the beast without fear could become its new master. These accounts connect to a broader tapestry of Native American traditions about forest-dwelling giants. Different tribes paint vastly different pictures of these beings' nature. Some describe them as peaceful forest guardians, others as mischievous tricksters who steal trinkets and food. But darker accounts exist, telling of aggressive predators who wage war on human settlements. The Champay legends particularly mirror the Choctaw experience. These accounts describe a massive, hair-covered being whose unbearable stench precedes its arrival. Like the LeFlore County creatures, the Champay actively hunts humans, displaying open hostility rather than mere territorial defense. Traditional Choctaw wisdom warned strongly against entering its domain. Records from 1849 provide an interesting precursor to the LeFlore County incident. Bertrand Tonnica, living in what was then called Eagletown, documented the observations of a hunter known as one-eyed Bascom. His description, a creature with long arms, stooped posture, and grayish-black hair, moving in an unnatural gait, aligns remarkably with later Bigfoot accounts. The convergence of these various accounts, combined with the verified historical elements of the LeFlore County story, suggests something more than pure fiction. The consistency of certain details, the overwhelming odor, the incredible strength, the preference for darkness appears across cultures and generations. While physical evidence remains elusive, the impact of these events on the Choctaw people is undeniable. Even today, when the wind carries certain ways across LeFlore County, old-timers say you can hear something that sounds almost like distant howls. The forest holds its secrets close, and some questions may never find definitive answers. But the legacy of those 40 warriors who dared to hunt the unknown lives on in the stories passed down through generations of Choctaw storytellers. Thanks for watching this extraordinary tale of the Choctaw-Bigfoot War. If you enjoy stories from Native American history and culture, hit subscribe and the notification bell to catch our next episode. This is Native Legends and History Stories. See you next time.